developed countries of the world, the rate is down to 1.5, 1.6. Quebec in Canada, for example, is 1.3. And countries have only offset this by immigration. That's what's maintained their population size. But it's a huge problem because in Japan, for example, where they haven't allowed immigration, you've got a decrease in the birth rate, a tremendous increase in the length of life, and therefore the population pyramid, which normally has a small number of people at the top and a lot of people, young people at the bottom, is now inverted. And of course, the potential for that smaller and smaller young group supporting the larger and larger old group is creating huge problems demographically, economically, and socially. And in many countries of the world, they have introduced a financial incentive to increase the birth rate. For example, in Italy, they have a deal where you get $1,000 automatically if you have a third child. Quebec, the same idea. So you can see that this argument that they were making with the Club of Rome about industrialization and development leads to overpopulation, in fact, is exactly the opposite. They've got it 100% wrong. But anyway, Maurice Strong took up this banner of the Club of Rome. And by the way, the connection there with the Obama administration is that one of the driving forces for the Club of Rome was a book called Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And he made all sorts of predictions about the world population that have all proved totally wrong. And one of the people working with him, and in fact was a co-author on some articles, was John Holdren, who is now the science czar in the Obama administration. But back to Maurice Strong, so he said, okay, we've got to get rid of the industrialized nations. Well, how do you go about doing that? Well, you can shut off the energy supply. If you can compare an industrialized nation to the engine in a car, and it's a good analogy because they both run on the fossil fuels primarily, you can squeeze the fuel lines, shut off the flow, and the car will stop, the engine will stop. But if you did that, people would scream immediately, and politicians have experienced that, for example, when the oil prices went up a couple of years ago, or with Jimmy Carter when he had the fuel lines and the social unrest that developed instantly. But if you could show that the byproduct of burning that fossil fuel, one of them is CO2, the primary byproduct, is destroying the planet through global warming and then subsequently climate change, then you could use that as a vehicle to shut down industries and say, no, they're producing too much CO2. And of course, that's come into the carbon footprint and reduction of carbon when they're really talking about reduction of CO2.
Let me just tell you.
That's the whole thrust of what's going on at Cancun in Mexico right now with the climate conference.
What's so remarkable to me is the level at which most of us have ingested and blindly accepted the news and not really been willing to look at the science. And of course, a lot of people say, well, do you know how many people have agreed that carbon dioxide is of danger to humanity and the Earth's going to fall apart if we don't do something and we're in a state of emergency? People have even said to me, how dare you? Who do you think you are? You're not a teacher. You're not a climatologist. You're just a journalist. Well, I'm not even a journalist. But the fact is that people need to understand the basics of how climatologists agree on what is. When you talk about 95% of the greenhouse gases that people are referring to as water vapor, and only 4% is CO2, I guess that leaves 1% to methane, correct?
Actually, methane is even smaller than that. Methane is about 0.009% of the greenhouse gases. And, of course, that's why back when they were attacking the cattle and the cattlemen and they wanted to get rid of beef and the people with the ethical treatment of animals and so on after the cattle farmers, so they pointed at methane and said, oh, it's a greenhouse gas and it's destroying the planet. In fact, the level of methane in the atmosphere has gone down for the last 15 years, but nobody talks about that, and that's why it's fallen off the edge of the table as a problem.
I can't remember who I was talking to because I talked to too many people.
Yeah.
But I was talking to somebody and they said, everybody has a bias. The question is, can you own your own? And if you can own your own, you can have an open conversation about something because you're not trying to hide your bias. Let me tell you my bias. I don't like the way animals are treated when they go to slaughter and the way they're treated before they come to slaughter. And I don't believe that animals have to suffer for us to eat. So that's just one thing. My other bias is that I don't like the chemicals that are used on vegetables, the chemicals that are dumped into our water, and the chemicals that are dumped into our air by aerosol spraying. So I have issues with that. I really do. And I have a fear that there's too much mercury in fossil fuels and other things we don't know about, that if we had a replacement for it, having nothing to do with carbon dioxide, if people who had more efficient forms of energy would be empowered to bring them through to the world instead of being attacked and their patents being taken and all that, I would go for it. But I have a legitimate concern for some of the chemicals that come out of fossil fuels.
First of all, your
That's my
comment
bias.
about bias is very legitimate. Everybody has a bias. It's a matter of the degree of that bias and a willingness to open your mind. And, of course, that's the advantage you have of opening your mind and saying, okay, I've got a bias, but I'm willing to listen to you. And if you can give me good, reasonable arguments and logical arguments, I think John Maynard Keynes said, if I learn something that changes my mind, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? And biases, by the way, are like problems, and they are a problem in themselves. They're only a problem if you're not aware of them.
Right.
And once you're aware of the problem, you're halfway to solving it. Once you're aware of the bias, then you can accommodate it. One of the things I like in England, for example, compared to, say, North American newspapers, is that you buy a newspaper in England because of its bias. For example, if you want a socialist newspaper, you buy the Manchester Guardian, or the Guardian as it's now called. And you know that's what you're going to get is a left-wing point of view. And therefore you can read the paper with that accommodation for the bias. Or if you want to read the right-wing point of view, you buy the Daily Telegraph. What I don't like is the idea that somehow the New York Times doesn't have a bias. A bias, if you declare it, is a much, much better way to deal with it. So I really appreciate what you're saying.
I don't even know if you know this, but I have a company called the Rainmaking Company, and that company provides a whole systems brand of communication services, marketing services, strategic services, and development services. And I have to tell you that with regard to being biased, I think it was 6 months ago, I interviewed the attorney who wanted to create an ecocide law. And she was really lovely coming on to the show. And I talked to her about the fact that carbon dioxide is being used as a vehicle to push through something that has nothing to do with the reality of what's happening with climate. And I was still open to her. And she had no idea about carbon. Her name is Polly Higgins, by the way. And she became open to learning in the middle of the show. I said, I agree with you on everything you're saying except this point right here, this one point. And this point is the basis by which this new cap and trade system is being created. All these new sustainable companies are being created. And all these new laws trying to push through Congress and the Senate are emerging. And she was very open. You know, here she is. She's a barrister from England. But I had to say my bias in order to open her up or to create an open space for her as a guest. But we have to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff here. And that's why I like the fact that you explain climatology and you really get into the details.
One of the things that the Obama administration did through the Environmental Protection Agency was there was a lawsuit that went before the Supreme Court arguing that the state of Massachusetts argued that CO2 was a toxic substance and therefore the EPA should deal with it because that's their responsibility, dealing with toxic substances. The EPA, many people argue, and I tend to agree with them, deliberately lost that case. The Supreme Court then ruled on that basis that CO2 was a toxic substance and therefore the EPA had the right to control it. Now, I'm telling you this because this goes to something towards the end of the story, because even though they're going to cancel the cap and trade or won't pass it in the Senate or the Congress, the EPA now has the authority to simply go in on their word and shut down an industry saying you're producing too much CO2. Now, what's interesting about the Supreme Court ruling on this toxic substance was it was 5-4. And people like Justice Scalia said, this is scientific rubbish. The EPA then, once they'd got that ruling of the toxic substance, had to, because of U.S. legislation, get comments from the public